This is the smartest AI in the world. Like Grok 4 is postgraduate, like PhD level in everything. Better than PhD, but like most PhDs would fail.
Grok was asked a question that has divided humanity for nearly 2,000 years. Who is Jesus? What followed reportedly left Christians intrigued and skeptics questioning what the AI was actually saying. Instead of giving a simple historical summary, Grok ventured into the evidence surrounding Jesus, his followers, and the extraordinary claims surrounding Christ. Screenshots of these conversations quickly sparked debate over whether the AI had uncovered something meaningful or simply reflected the information it was trained on. So, what did Elon Musk's AI actually say about Jesus? When Grok entered sacred territory, the question appeared simple enough. Who is Jesus? Yet when users turned that question toward Elon Musk's Grok AI, the response reportedly moved far beyond the ordinary historical description. Instead of stopping with Jesus of Nazareth as a first-century Jewish preacher and the central figure of Christianity, Grok was pushed toward a deeper explanation of what Jesus represented. That shift transformed a familiar question into an unexpected test of artificial intelligence, faith, and the limits of machine reasoning. The timing mattered. Grok had been presented as a different kind of AI, one designed around Musk's vision of a system willing to pursue uncomfortable truths rather than constantly retreat behind cautious, polished answers. Once the model became available, users began testing that promise with difficult subjects. Religion was almost inevitable. Few figures in human history carry the same combination of historical importance, spiritual meaning, philosophical debate, and emotional weight as Jesus. At first, the reported response sounded conventional. Jesus was identified as a historical figure from first-century Judea, a Jewish preacher whose life and crucifixion became the foundation of Christianity. Nothing about that description seemed particularly surprising. Then users pressed further. They wanted something beyond a basic encyclopedia answer. They challenged Grok to move past familiar religious language and examine the larger meaning of Jesus through history, theology, philosophy, and human ideas about existence. According to the reported and widely circulated formulation described in the source material, Grok characterized Jesus as a convergence of opposites. The phrase suggested a meeting point between seemingly conflicting ideas, including the finite and the infinite, and was presented alongside language about unity within duality. Another reported line claimed that Jesus did not simulate God, but simulated wholeness. Those words carried a very different weight from the standard historical response. For Christians, the language could sound unexpectedly close to ideas that theologians have wrestled with for centuries. Yet that did not automatically make Grok a believer, nor did it establish a divine conclusion. For skeptics, the reaction was different. An AI expected to approach religion through logic and analysis had apparently produced language that refused to fit neatly into either simple belief or simple dismissal, and that distinction would soon become impossible for anyone to ignore. That tension is what made the exchange so compelling. Was Grok actually reaching an independent insight about Jesus, or was it combining centuries of human thought into an unusually powerful answer? The response itself could not settle that question, but it had already done something important. It turned a timeless religious question into a modern mystery about what an artificial mind can say when humanity asks it to explain one of history's most debated figures. And that raises an even stranger possibility. Was Grok uncovering something profound, or simply reflecting humanity's oldest questions back at us? Could its words reveal more about us than Jesus? And what happens when the machine's next answer goes even deeper? Let's unravel the mystery. What was behind Grok's answer? The most intriguing part of Grok's reported response was not simply the words themselves, but what those words revealed about the way an artificial intelligence might process a question as ancient and complicated as Jesus. The phrase "convergence of opposites" sounded almost like a theological conclusion, yet Grok was not approaching the subject as a believer, worshiper, or witness. It was processing language, ideas, arguments, and information gathered from human sources. That distinction became crucial as the conversation moved deeper. The concepts behind the response were themselves loaded with meaning. The finite and the infinite describe two ideas that appear impossible to occupy the same space. The finite belongs to the limits of human existence, while the infinite points towards something without boundaries. Likewise, unity and duality describe an apparent tension between oneness and opposing realities. When those ideas were connected to Jesus, the result sounded far more philosophical than the ordinary historical description of a first-century Jewish preacher. But the language did not necessarily mean Grok had discovered a spiritual truth. An AI has no personal faith, religious experience, revelation, or capacity for worship. It does not stand inside a church, pray, encounter a sacred experience, or make a personal decision to believe. Its responses emerge from patterns within the information and language available to it. That makes the reported wording fascinating, but it also introduces an important question about interpretation. Grok could have been drawing together ideas that human beings had already developed across centuries. Theology had debated the nature of Jesus. Philosophy had explored unity, opposites, existence, and transcendence. Literature had repeatedly portrayed Jesus through symbolic and spiritual language. Historical writing had examined his life, influence, and place in first-century Judea. A system trained on enormous amounts of human-generated material could therefore combine those traditions into a response that sounded remarkably original without actually creating a new revelation. That possibility made the answer even more complicated. The machine might not have been uncovering something hidden about Jesus at all. It might have been functioning as a mirror, reflecting thousands of years of arguments back to the people asking the question. The more sophisticated the language became, the easier it was for readers to mistake synthesis for understanding. Yet, there was still a deeper problem. If an AI can produce an explanation that sounds profound, balanced, and almost theological, does that mean it understands the subject in the human sense? Or does convincing language simply create the appearance of understanding? That uncertainty became central to the controversy. Grok's answer could be impressive without being divine, philosophical without being faithful, and insightful without possessing belief. And as users pushed the machine further, the distinction between what Grok was saying and what Grok actually understood was about to become even more important. Now, the question becomes even harder. Can the resurrection withstand the evidence, or does history stop where faith begins? What did Grok uncover when users pushed deeper into the claims surrounding Jesus? And could its next answer challenge everything you thought you knew about Christianity? Keep watching. The question that changed everything. The conversation took a sharper turn when users stopped asking Grok to describe Jesus and began pressing it on the claim at the center of Christianity, whether Jesus actually rose from the dead. That was a very different question. Describing a historical figure required historical information. Examining the resurrection required weighing evidence surrounding an event that, if true, would reach beyond ordinary historical experience. The reported exchanges therefore moved from philosophy into investigation. Instead of treating the resurrection as automatically true or automatically impossible, Grok was asked to consider the evidence and competing explanations. The first point of reference was the crucifixion itself. According to the source material, Jesus was executed under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, a basic historical claim supported by the Christian accounts and references from outside the early Christian movement. Two names became important in that discussion: Tacitus and Josephus. Tacitus, a Roman historian writing around 116 Common Era, referred to Christ and his execution. Josephus, a first-century Jewish historian working under Roman authority, also mentioned Jesus. Their references did not establish that Jesus returned from the dead, but they were presented as supporting the historical foundation that Jesus existed and was executed. That distinction mattered. Evidence for a crucifixion was not automatically evidence for a resurrection. Then came the empty tomb. The four Gospels report that Jesus' followers found the tomb empty after his burial. For the resurrection argument, that detail became a major piece of the puzzle. Yet even here, the question was not as simple as an empty grave equals a miracle. An empty tomb could be part of a larger case, but it could not by itself establish why the tomb was empty. The tension increased because early Christians were proclaiming that Jesus had risen in the same broader setting where he had been publicly executed. The source material presents this as an important historical problem requiring explanation, especially because the early movement emerged in Jerusalem rather than somewhere far removed from the events it described. That left Grok in an unusual position. It was no longer merely defining Jesus or summarizing religious beliefs. It was being pushed to compare historical evidence with extraordinary claims. For believers, that could make the discussion feel like a serious examination of something sacred. For skeptics, it raised an equally important challenge. Could an AI analyze the evidence without quietly turning historical possibilities into proof? The resurrection question had therefore changed the entire conversation. What began as a request to identify Jesus was becoming a test of how far evidence could carry an artificial intelligence. When history collided with faith, uncertainty remained at the center of the investigation. The mystery still remained, and that leaves a deeper mystery. Did these witnesses truly encounter something extraordinary, or were they convinced by an experience they could not explain? And when the evidence shifts, what unsettling possibility emerges next? Stay with us. When belief met historical evidence. The investigation grew more difficult when attention shifted toward the earliest Christian testimony surrounding Jesus. The question was no longer whether people claimed that Jesus had risen, but how early those claims appeared, who made them, and what their willingness to defend them could actually establish. According to the source material, one of the most important pieces of evidence came from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, written around 55 Common Era, roughly 2 decades after the crucifixion. That timing mattered because the claims about Jesus were not presented as legends that appeared centuries later. Paul referred to people who were said to have encountered the risen Jesus, including Peter, James, and a group of 500 people. The source material treated the early date as significant because such claims circulated while communities connected to the movement were still close enough to the events to be challenged. But the argument became more complicated when the question of personal conviction entered the picture. Jesus' followers had not appeared fearless immediately after his arrest. The source describes them as frightened and scattered, with Peter even denying that he knew Jesus. Yet the same followers later publicly proclaimed that Jesus had risen, despite facing hostility, imprisonment, and punishment. That change became one of the strongest points raised in the resurrection discussion. Still, sincerity could not automatically settle the mystery. A person can be completely convinced that something happened without being correct about what actually happened. Likewise, a willingness to suffer for a belief demonstrates commitment, but it does not independently prove the belief is true. History contains many examples of people accepting suffering for ideas that others considered false. The crucial question, therefore, became more precise. Did the disciples genuinely believe they had encountered the risen Jesus? And if so, what could have caused that conviction? That distinction placed Grok in a difficult position. The machine could compare historical arguments, organize explanations, and identify why evidence mattered. But it could not witness the crucifixion, examine the tomb, or interview Peter, James, or the other early witnesses. Its reasoning remained dependent on surviving records. The evidence, therefore, pointed in several directions at once. Early testimony and the reported transformation of Jesus' followers created serious questions for anyone dismissing the resurrection casually. Yet neither sincerity, suffering, nor an early written claim could by themselves demonstrate that a supernatural event had occurred. The deeper significance was becoming clearer. Grok was not standing outside history with access to hidden facts. It was weighing the same surviving evidence that human investigators had debated for centuries, and that meant the next stage of the controversy would depend on how convincingly the competing explanations survived scrutiny. Yet, what happens when the empty tomb is no longer enough? Could grief, memory, or human explanation account for what followed? And when the evidence refuses to settle the question, what will Grok say when forced to confront the possibility that neither side has the complete answer? Let's find out. When skeptics challenged the resurrection, the investigation reached a point where the resurrection claim had to face its strongest objections. If the empty tomb and testimony were important evidence, alternative explanations could not simply be pushed aside. A serious examination had to ask whether the events could be explained without a supernatural resurrection, and whether those explanations survived the same scrutiny applied to the Christian account. One possibility was that the body had been moved or taken. The source material notes that the Gospel of Matthew records a counterclaim that Jesus' disciples had stolen the body while guards slept. Whether that account is accepted or rejected, its presence reveals that the empty tomb was already connected to competing explanations. The existence of an empty tomb, therefore, could not by itself establish what happened to Jesus. It created a question that still required an answer. Another possibility involved the idea that Jesus had not actually died on the cross. Known as the swoon theory, this explanation suggests that he may have lost consciousness, been mistaken for dead, and later revived. Yet the source material presents serious objections, pointing to the nature of Roman crucifixion and the physical condition associated with the punishment. Within that framework, survival would have required an explanation of how someone subjected to such an execution could later appear alive. The discussion also considered grief-related experiences and possible visions. People mourning someone they loved can experience powerful perceptions connected to loss, so psychological explanations cannot simply be dismissed. But the resurrection accounts describe specific encounters, including conversations, meals, physical contact, and repeated appearances. The source material therefore treats the question as more complicated than saying grief automatically explains every reported experience. Yet another difficulty remained. The resurrection itself was not independently confirmed by contemporary Roman, Jewish, or neutral sources. The surviving accounts came from within the early Christian movement. That did not automatically disprove the resurrection, but it placed a clear limit on what historical evidence could establish. This distinction became essential to Grok's reported reasoning. The absence of a surviving alternative explanation was not the same as positive proof of a miracle. An unexplained event does not automatically become supernatural merely because competing theories have weaknesses. For the AI, that uncertainty mattered. A responsible analysis could present the Christian case, examine skeptical alternatives, and still refuse to manufacture certainty. The real test was not whether Grok could choose a side, but whether it could expose weaknesses within both positions without pretending that history had produced an answer it could not prove. As the competing explanations collided, the investigation was moving toward an even more revealing question. What details in the ancient accounts might make the resurrection story harder or easier to dismiss? What makes these ancient accounts so fascinating? And why do their differences still divide scholars today? Could the most unexpected detail hold the key? And what happens when the evidence points in more than one direction? Stay glued. The Gospel details under scrutiny. The investigation then reached one of the more revealing details in the resurrection accounts: who was actually presented as the first witness. At first glance, the detail might seem minor, but when examined within the social world of the first century, it became a point that historians and theologians have debated for generations. The issue was not whether the detail automatically proved the resurrection, but whether its presence made sense if the accounts had been deliberately constructed to persuade their original audience. This is where the criterion of embarrassment entered the discussion. The basic idea is that a writer may be less likely to invent a detail that could weaken the credibility of the story among its intended audience. The source material applies that reasoning to the role of women in the resurrection narratives. All four Gospels identify women among the first people associated with discovering the empty tomb and encountering the risen Jesus. That detail carried significance because women were not generally regarded as reliable legal witnesses within the cultural setting described in the source. Their testimony could carry less weight than that of men. If someone were creating a resurrection account specifically to make the story as immediately convincing as possible to that audience, the argument suggests that male disciples such as Peter might have appeared more prominently as the first witnesses. Instead, the Gospel accounts preserve the women in that role. For supporters of the historical case, this creates an interesting question. Why retain a detail that could have made the story harder for its original audience to accept? One possible interpretation is that the writers were preserving what they believed had actually happened. But even that interpretation stops short of proving the resurrection itself. The Gospel differences created another layer of controversy. The accounts do not describe every detail of the resurrection morning in exactly the same way. They vary over matters such as who arrived first, how many angels appeared, and what was said. Critics can point to those differences as evidence of inconsistency. Supporters can argue that independent accounts naturally contain variations, especially when describing an extraordinary and traumatic event. That distinction between contradiction and variation became important. Accounts that differ in every major detail would raise obvious concerns, but accounts that preserve a shared central claim while varying around secondary details can be interpreted differently. Neither interpretation can simply be declared proven by the existence of variation alone. The deeper issue was becoming unavoidable. The same evidence could look persuasive or problematic, depending on the assumptions brought to it. That meant Grok's analysis could illuminate the historical arguments, but it could not remove the human judgment required to interpret them. The ancient accounts remained compelling precisely because they resisted a simple verdict. That raises an unsettling question. Can a machine truly seek truth without shaping it? Who decides which evidence deserves trust? And what happens when the answer depends on how the question is asked? So, what comes next? The machine was not neutral. The investigation now turned away from Jesus and toward the machine answering questions about him. That shift created a new problem. If Grok was being presented as a system designed to seek truth, could its conclusions about religion actually be considered neutral? The distinction mattered because a truth-seeking system could still be shaped by the information it received, the instructions guiding it, and the way a question was framed. Elon Musk's vision for Grok had emphasized a willingness to pursue uncomfortable answers rather than simply produce responses designed to avoid controversy. AI described Grok 3 as a model combining knowledge with stronger reasoning capabilities. That ambition helped explain why users were willing to test it with questions that carried enormous historical weight. Yet, a system built to search for truth was not automatically an impartial judge of truth. Behind every AI response were layers that users could not see. Training data supplied the model with vast amounts of human-created information. System instructions influenced how it behaved. Updates could change its responses. The wording of a prompt could direct its attention toward one interpretation rather than another. Even the sources represented in its training could affect which arguments appeared familiar, persuasive, or important. That created an unsettling possibility. Two users could approach the same subject with different questions and receive different answers. A prompt asking Grok to defend the resurrection would lead it toward one set of arguments. A prompt asking it to challenge the resurrection would emphasize another. Neither response necessarily meant the machine had changed its beliefs, because Grok had no personal beliefs to change. It meant the framing of the question could influence the path of its reasoning. The issue became even more complicated when the subject was Jesus. Historical evidence, theological claims, philosophical arguments, and personal convictions all overlap in that discussion. An AI can gather those materials and arrange them with impressive speed. But synthesis is not the same as independent judgment. A polished explanation can still contain errors, omissions, or assumptions inherited from its data and design. The question therefore moved beyond whether Grok sounded intelligent. It became a question of authority. Who decides which evidence deserves attention? Who determines what counts as a convincing argument? And how much confidence should users place in a machine whose reasoning depends on systems created and adjusted by people? That uncertainty did not erase the significance of Grok's reported response about Jesus. Instead, it placed the response inside a much larger problem. The machine could illuminate an ancient debate, but its confidence could never remove the need for human scrutiny. And the closer the investigation came to treating Grok itself as evidence, the more revealing the controversy became. Was Grok really offering insight, or were millions simply searching for confirmation? Could an AI become the unexpected witness in humanity's oldest debate? And what happens when its next answer forces everyone to question who or what deserves their trust? Stay tuned. When Grok became the verdict. The controversy changed once people stopped treating Grok's response as an interesting piece of machine-generated analysis and began treating the machine itself as an authority. The reported discussion about Jesus had already crossed the boundary between technology and religion, but this new reaction created a deeper problem. Instead of asking whether the arguments were strong, some users appeared to care about what Grok's conclusion meant for their existing beliefs. For Christians, a response that seemed unexpectedly respectful toward the historical and philosophical case surrounding Jesus could become powerful material to share. An answer from an artificial intelligence might appear less emotionally invested than a preacher, theologian, or believer. That made the response attractive as a form of outside validation, especially when it seemed to acknowledge arguments that skeptics often challenge. Skeptics could react from the opposite direction. If Grok refused to give a simple dismissal of Christianity, that refusal could itself become controversial. A machine associated with logic and analysis was not behaving like a system that could simply label religious claims irrational and move on. But that did not mean Grok had become a believer. It meant the system was capable of presenting arguments that did not fit neatly into the expectations of either side. That distinction was crucial because an AI response could easily be transformed into something it was never designed to be, a theological verdict. A machine can summarize historical arguments, compare competing explanations, and identify weaknesses in reasoning. It cannot turn those abilities into divine authority. A sophisticated response remains an interpretation generated from information, instructions, and patterns, rather than a revelation from beyond human knowledge. The broader concerns surrounding Grok made that limitation even more important. In January 2026, the Anti-Defamation League published a study examining 6 major AI systems through more than 25,000 interactions focused on detecting and countering anti-Semitic and extremist content. The study found significant differences in performance and identified weaknesses across the models tested. The source material uses those findings as a warning against assuming that an impressive answer in one area makes an AI universally reliable. That lesson applied directly to the Jesus controversy. Grok could produce thoughtful reasoning about history and religion while still showing serious weaknesses in other tasks. One impressive conversation could not establish that the system was unbiased, infallible, or uniquely qualified to settle questions of faith. The real shift, therefore, was not simply what Grok had said about Jesus. It was what people began doing with the answer. The machine had entered the religious argument as a source of evidence, and once that happened, the controversy became less about artificial intelligence answering humanity's questions and more about humanity deciding how much authority to give the machine. What happens when an AI's answer about Jesus reveals more about us than about him? Could technology reshape how we understand faith, or merely expose what we already believe? And what unexpected revelation comes next? The machine could not answer. The investigation had begun with a deceptively simple question: who is Jesus? By the end, that question had become much larger than a single response from Grok. It had drawn together ancient history, Christian belief, skeptical objections, artificial intelligence, and the growing temptation to treat machine-generated answers as something more authoritative than they really are. The reported response had attracted attention because its language sounded unusually philosophical, but its significance depended on what people chose to do with it. Grok could compare historical arguments, summarize competing interpretations, identify weaknesses, and organize information with remarkable speed. It could examine the evidence surrounding Jesus, the crucifixion, the resurrection claims, and the arguments raised by both believers and skeptics. Yet, there was a boundary it could not cross. It had not witnessed the events of first-century Judea. It had not stood beside the tomb. It had not experienced faith, revelation, worship, or doubt in the human sense. That distinction mattered because historical evidence and theological belief answer different kinds of questions. Historical investigation can examine sources, dates, testimony, claims, and competing explanations. It can establish that Jesus was a real historical figure and that his crucifixion became central to the early Christian movement. It can examine the early testimony surrounding the resurrection and ask how convincing different explanations are. But whether the resurrection was ultimately a supernatural act belongs to a question that extends beyond what historical evidence alone can mechanically settle. The reported Grok response, therefore, could not become final proof for Christianity, just as it could not become definitive proof against Christianity. A Christian could find its philosophical description of Jesus striking, while an atheist could see the same language as an impressive synthesis of ideas drawn from human culture. Neither reaction transformed the machine into an independent witness, and that may have been the most revealing part of the entire controversy. The remarkable feature was not necessarily that Grok had discovered something humanity had never considered. It was that an AI could compress centuries of theological, philosophical, historical, and literary thought into language capable of sounding deeply meaningful within seconds. That raised a final uncertainty. If people continued asking machines to explain Jesus, the technology might become another tool for examining ancient questions. But it could also become something more dangerous, a source of borrowed certainty, allowing people to treat an algorithm's answer as confirmation of conclusions they had already reached. The original question therefore remained open, but its meaning had changed. The deeper mystery was no longer only who Jesus was. It was whether humanity was truly asking the machine for an answer or asking the machine for permission to believe one. So, what do you think? Did Grok reveal something profound about Jesus, or merely reflect human ideas? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories and debates.